Museum. My name is David Maruzzella. I'm a curatorial assistant here at DPAM. Over the past 18 months, it's been my immense pleasure to work with Jim Duignan of Stockyard Institute on our current exhibition, and in particular on the publication that accompanies the exhibition. For nearly a year, Jim and I met weekly over Zoom to talk about his life, his art, and the countless projects, large and small, that Stockyard Institute and its collaborators have produced over the past 25 years. On many occasions, Jim would show up at my apartment with bundles of ephemera and archival material for me to sort through. Oftentimes after I had already gotten into bed and come up pajamas, I would run out to meet him in the alley to pick up some deliveries from him. On other occasions, I would find old documentation of past projects in the deep corners of the internet and share them with Jim, much to his surprise, as he hadn't seen them in decades, and I think some of which he had never seen before. The result is this beautiful exhibition catalog that we're here tonight to celebrate. If you haven't gotten one yet, I encourage you to please pick one up. You can grab one downstairs at the front desk. We also have them online, distributed through the University of Chicago Press. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to thank all the contributors to the publication: Jorge Lucero, Allison Peters Quinn, Jennifer Gray, Nato Thompson, Rachel Ellis Harper, and Julie Rodrigues Widholm. And this publication absolutely would not have been possible without Toby and Molly of our studio. Toby's here with us tonight, so please give Toby and Molly a big round of applause. Now on to tonight's event. It is an honor to present a conversation between Jim Duignan and Lavie Raven in celebration of the exhibition catalog, Stockyard Institute, 25 Years of Art and Radical Pedagogy. And just a quick introduction to our two participants. Jim Duignan is an artist and founder of Stockyard Institute, a radical art and pedagogical project that for over 25 years has taken to the absolute extreme, in my opinion, and in the most compelling way possible, Joseph Boyd's famous claim that everybody is an artist. Since the early 1990s, Jim has also taught at the College of Ed here at DePaul and is the founder of the Secondary Education Visual Arts program. Lavie Raven is an artist, educator, and as I learned recently when Lavie came by for an interview, was a student in the first class that Jim ever taught here at DePaul University. He has taught in public schools in the Chicago area for over 20 years. He's a Fulbright Distinguished Teacher and co-founder of the University of Hip Hop, a multi-disciplinary school of the street arts. He has contributed and collaborated to Stockyard Institute projects since its inception, and as if that wasn't enough, I learned just last week, reading an article about the exhibition, that he was also a legend and pioneer of the Chicago hip-hop scene. So if you haven't heard his music, I encourage you to go look it up. With that, I give it over to Lavie and Jim. Thanks.
Well, thank you everybody for coming here as we celebrate the catalog and celebrate this partnership that we've had for close to 30 years. I mean, I know you've been teaching 25 years plus already, but it was no secret to me that having Lavie in my class was certainly a kind of influential moment, as I understood him, to kind of tell everybody around that he was planning to shape his pedagogical work, through the architecture of hip hop. And I had no idea whatsoever how he was going to do that, or what that even actually meant. But it was very sort of clear at that moment that we were going to stay in touch. My particular sort of interests were, from music and from public art movements, and I'd say most of what I was interested in came about when I was in high school, 1975, sort of entering my last year at Taft. It had been, kind of a moment in culture where there was a kind of a split. The art world and the kind of music scene, as I saw it, was kind of bland. Certainly, you were at a point where people were sort of taking sides, and my interests were particularly in you know, in the neighborhoods and the kind of limitations of conceptual art. And, you know, being in that Chicago Public High School was certainly a kind of revelation for me, based on, you know, having an art experience in the city prior to high school that was, you know, it's horrible, you know, horrible experience. Well, I mean, I struggled in school, and I think that had a lot to do with, you know, being outside and dealing with the kind of natural spaces of the city, and, you know, looking for this kind of anarchistic approach to, you know, living, to sort of building content, to, you know, kind of living your best life. And I certainly thought that that was a kind of moment that, you know, that sort of changed everything for me. In 1975, I was working in an asylum. You know, the Ramones kind of knocked me out. Musically, I think that whole punk scene was something that gave the people that I was around in that circle a kind of framework to sort of do things ourselves. But that was that moment, I think, you know, meeting Lavie and coming to DePaul and wondering if I could, in fact, you know, build something out in the city, kind of where I hung out. I was just starting a kind of graduate program at the University of Illinois. And, you know, it was a very conceptual place. And I had met Michael Piazza, and kind of a quick sort of ally. And we began to kind of work together. And I'll just say one thing about that kind of initial experience in meeting Lavie. I not only didn't know what he was sort of thinking about in terms of building a kind of pedagogical framework around hip hop, you know, but it didn't mean that it didn't sort of stir everybody up. And I walked into this first class, and I think I was probably more interested in sort of poetry and public art than I was with whatever the orientation to secondary education was. But it was certainly that sort of experience of just wanting to bring some of those questions I had around, you know, being in the city and working with public artists. Inigo Manglano Valle was an artist that I had met at Wells High School in the early 90s, and Nilda Pauly, who was running the dropout prevention program there. Culture and Action was just sort of percolating in the city. Inigo had built street level video around that. You know, he was introducing me to artists like Mario and Rafa, and I just brought them into the classroom. And that was sort of the moment where I think Lavie and I kind of connected.
Yeah.
That's a long
Yeah.
introduction, but
That was
I thought
good.
there
That
was
was
a
good.
bit of a context around these 20-year sort of circles, you know, or cycles.
Yeah, I remember having Jim as my professor because he was the first person that kind of I think addressed like illuminated writing. The advisement that he gave me on my papers was something very different than I had received before. And connecting with him through that, through just kind of research and prose, was a beautiful space to meet. And I don't even know how the conversation came up of what our collective on our side of the universe was doing. But Jim invited us to an event that he was doing at a car wash over here on Webster. And that was the first kind of cross-fertilization between the community that he was a part of that I really wasn't fully aware of, and then our hip hop activist kind of hardcore community. And at that event, it was kind of surreal and beautiful to have Stony Island, to have the Brickheads performing and dancing in this car wash. Cars being washed at the time as well. I believe the cars were being washed during the exhibit, and there was artwork all over the place. And that was a catalyst for a longstanding relationship. And when you mentioned 1975, I was like, where was I in 1975? Because I was thinking on the way over here, what may have birthed my perspective on the universe. And in 1976, 75 and a half, my family had left the United States in self-exile for Africa and had packed up everything they had, and we moved to Liberia. And growing up in this creative spiritual collective from the south side of Chicago off of 83rd and Cottage Grove, the Transition East organization, which later became Soul Veg, which later became Montu Dance Theater, which later became the Alayo Dance Troupe, which later became IPE, the Institute for Positive Education, grew up in a very pro-Black, activist-oriented liberation theology household. And everything that we did involved every aspect of creativity. My mother was making all of our dashikis and our clothes. There was, we were going to service, and there's djembes and congas and shakerays and cowbells, and we're singing the Shema in our own way. And I remember the song that they made up was, Toda Yehovah, Toda Yehovah. So then all the kids could be like, Toda Yehovah for the birds and the bees, Toda Yehovah. But growing up with that rhythm and surrounded by that art was the seed for me that this type of multivalent existence was something that I was going to probably be doing all my life. But in meeting Jim, crossing communities, you cross communities in high school, right? Especially because when I was in high school, 84 through 88 was the end of the peak of the integration era, sparked by busing, which subsequently was ended. So there were so many. My person at the time that I met later was from the Taft area, right, over on Raven Street, busing all the way down to Kenwood Academy on the south side. And so you had all these young people from different backgrounds meeting in high school in the 80s and influencing each other, going to each other's homes and sharing things with each other that we never had. And then coming out of that, 6 years later, and trying to redefine myself as a learner of the universe, running in the gym was key because it gave a sense of faith in our bizarre, creative way of thinking. Because if you've read Jim's writings, or if you've heard him speak at length on certain things, Jim's a poetic prosaicist, or I don't know if that's the right word, but his intellectual concepts are poetic. And he pointed that out in my writing and gave me some faith there. So those subsequent collaborations, starting with the car wash, and then really, for me, the next bump would have been San Miguel, and bringing many people that are still prominent leaders in the hip hop community today in our seed form over to San Miguel, because Jim had created this beautiful space there. Anything else?
Yeah. Well, I think that was certainly another one of those sort of experiments in really having the opportunity to kind of organize this practice. I was asked by a couple missionaries from the back of the yards who were planning to start a experimental middle school around 48th and Damon to come in and provide them with a kind of art curriculum, which I thought, well, that didn't really interest me all that much. Then they sort of began talking about how they didn't have a background in education and that I could really sort of do whatever they want. They had a different sort of focus on kind of dealing with the human beings in that community on their terms. And so that became sort of the moment where I was working with Michael Piazza. I was working with Greg Mitchie. We were sort of all in cahoots, and Lavie, just sort of thinking about how we could somehow work together, all sort of joining in on our individual practices and our individual sort of groups and collectives. And so I had acquired an abandoned school, and it was really sort of beautiful to me that it was an abandoned school where we set up a kind of office for publications and poets and the University of Hip Hop. And it just became a kind of epicenter in the back of the yard to just sort of explore some of these ideas. But basically, it was really about bringing all our friends together and doing whatever we wanted. And it just seemed to me as though that's how we should shape this kind of curriculum or this pedagogical practice based on a kind of, connection to what we were very curious about, or that we loved, or that we were just, expert at. And so that was a kind of really important moment for me too, just having so many artists sort of converge on that space. And in many cases since then, kind of quietly and not so quietly, when Lavie would come in with static, they'd start painting, the man would come in.
That man
And we get evicted, and that was just, it's a kind of a badge of honor. That happened all the time. Barracuda Films came in, and we were working with gang members in that community who weren't interested in kind of being part of that school. Ed and Gordon had gone to all of the local schools on 48th Street, Chavez and Hedges and St. Joe's, and asked for their dropout lists, and found the first 18 boys and girls in that community and asked them if they wanted to be part of this experiment. So this other group, maybe 6 or 8 of them, were the group that I brought over to this abandoned school, and we started kind of working with and talking to, and it was very clear to me that those people that I would bring into that space were kind of, sort of loving, safe, beings that had a particular kind of artistry and spirituality and sensitivity to the kind of, kids in the neighborhood, the kids of the neighborhood, which we were all sort of past kids of the neighborhood. But yeah, that was a great project. And yes, the car wash was a running car wash when we were.
Yeah, that's right. I remember
doing
cars
it.
going
Yeah.
through there. And I actually remember just going on my own and illegally painting 2 murals right there where the car wash exit
Where they
came out. I think,
Yeah.
and they just let it stay up. What was really nice about San Miguel as well was that at that point, our community and our leaders were just like hardcore hip hoppers. And, our purpose was cultural regeneration. We had the Chiraq Nation, Chicago Respect Our City's Kids was very strong then, and we had like 200, 300 kids meeting across from the Museum of Science and Industry to have these meetings and conventions and breaking circles. But we really hadn't thought about like how you teach hip hop. And I remember Jim asking me to come work with the brothers before the school was obtained, and having to think about, how would I teach these young boys like writing, and like how to teach them graffiti writing like on their own terms, to give them like the background and the foundation, but so that they could do it. And Jim inviting this over to the big school, no one I think had really thought about how do we teach it. So I remember actually the first big event was in the gym, because the Brickheads were at that event, and we had a meeting beforehand about our little strategy. Someone's going to branch off and do writing. We're going to have a little cipher. We're going to have a breaking circle. And then we really had to think about like how we want to present something to a young person and give them the tools and the opportunity and practice to do it. And then going into the school was the same level, like Static. He was really just beginning kind of his muralist excursions. And I asked him to paint animals because it was like this school environment. And we did this like nature kind of series on the stairwells inside. And the Brickheads continued teaching like for 1.5 years at that time. Simultaneously, Ivan Watkins was in charge of the cultural he had a big position at the Chicago Park District, and his purpose was to invade the Park District with street culture and brown culture. And so he got all these same groups to go out and do the mini performances in the parks. And that was a huge thing too, because we didn't want to just perform. We wanted to leave kids with something that they could do and opportunities. So many of the folks that went into that San Miguel building, we didn't go in as educators, but that experience gave us the first tools to know that we were educators and to ask ourselves, like, how will we manifest to spread this culture kind of in an organized manner in some way? And then the University of Hip Hop happened. I was just trying to, it was after all of that. It was like 2 years later when the University of Hip Hop happened. At San Miguel also, what I learned was service in terms of bringing, Jim brought all these crazy artists together from all these backgrounds, but the purpose was to serve the youth that were coming in that building. And there were no pre-questions. Like a lot of times people go in with a preconceived idea of what they want to do with young people, with the outcome already decided. And Jim's way of doing things was always through conversation and conscientious process. And what they called the mimesis, the unknown horizon, really got to visualize what can happen when that horizon is not dictated and it simply comes out of the initiative and the voices of the young people. So watching the Game Proof Suit project unfold and all these weird and interesting artists and hip hoppers like going into this building and doing all this stuff was just like amazing. And I would say even to this day, my purpose is always to have the process and the content dictated by youth interests and what they are interested in doing for their community. And I appreciate that opportunity to practice that and then to go forward practicing that with the University of Hip Hop.
I think we were all practicing that, I think that the overarching sort of idea to the youth and to the parents and everybody in that neighborhood was, what kind of community do you want to live in? That was the kind of shaping of everything that we did. So it just became really sort of amazing that all these sort of graffiti artists and poets and would walk into this space. It made just made the climate in that space just so open to sort of exchange ideas and just share out, who we were, what we were interested in. How do you get from here to there? How do you live sort of in this neighborhood in Chicago at this time? I realized a couple things early on, and, I gained so much insight from Lavie too, in the way in which he just sort of worked with people and gathered his own sort of groups together, that, this was the moment when I had those young people over in that building and everyone was coming through. We probably spent in 1995, 2 months that summer without really making anything. We were sort of, inviting the young people, all of us, to bring in images of their great grandmothers and notes and drawings. And we just sort of built this wall kind of like downstairs that just sort of made that space very democratic, very much about sharing and the construction of a kind of collective knowledge. And it wasn't until maybe 2 months in that one of the boys had said that his biggest fear was to be shot in the back accidentally on his way to school. And then it became really quiet in the space. And I think we all realized that, and maybe this wasn't explicitly the intention, but we were all really in need of building the kinds of projects we wanted to build, but based on the kind of collective questions, from everybody. And also it was very clear for me in my background that I wanted to be able to talk about really difficult things, things that bothered you, and make a more inhabitable kind of space in a school, in a neighborhood, in a body. And so being able to have that kind of all those artists around that building, gave us all the kind of, I think, permission to really let the young people kind of build the kind of practice that we were looking for, that we were working on, but we seemed very much outliers, to the kind of status quo. Because most of the people, even at that time in '95, were, that I would get the most trouble from would be educators, or would be, in the art world. And that was perfectly all right with me, as we were kind of wrestling with sort of working through this kind of other space, but also drawing a lot on our kind of entire lives, the arc of our lives, and wanting to, just ask better questions about how do we kind of work together, like through classrooms, through the street, through our work, and basically have this opportunity to sort of refer to these young people as producers, and that's what everybody was doing. Lavie and Stony Island and all these kind of groups coming through would just recognize these young people as producers, and that made all the difference in the world. One is right here, Davion, who I met in 5th grade, but just a shout out to Davion.
Wanted to mention too the magical essence of being a nomadic institution, because Jim, what I've seen is it's like almost like spot hopping based on the availability of space, the need in the community, and the request to set up shop there. And I remember in like '97, Mama Camille O'Day was in charge of the Southwest Youth Collaborative, told us, University of Hip Hop, she's like, I think it's so important that you guys are a nomadic institution. Because at the time we were like, oh man, we don't have a base and blah, blah, blah. And she said, but you guys go out and you serve wherever you're asked. There's never any sort of wall or anything that's going to catch you up from just going and dispatching. And fortunately, for like the last 27 years, that's how all of our young people and educators have responded to the call. Seeing, what was it, Jim, I don't know what, 17 years later in Austin at another school with all these other artists, right? And all these other activists doing things from the community's initiative, right? The same exact kind of nomadic existence for like a 3 to 5 year stint is what I kind of feel like those cycles were. And what Camille, I think, was really stressing was that sometimes organizations, when they are in a fixed state, become so beholden to other powers that be that they lose the liberation dynamic and the fire, that came with them in the beginning. And just wanted to mention too about the University of Hip Hop, being all these organizations that started in '95 to '97, and the majority of them officially started in 1996. When the kids at Hubbard High School asked to form a school of hip hop, I was like, well, kind of what have I learned from all these people that we're around is we just need to create a space so they can have a conversation and develop this school. And so I reached out to Generation Y, Jeremy and Jillian, Mama Camille, and I was like, what do we do? And they said, well, we're going to have a popular education sessions with them. We're going to teach them democratic processes, consensus building. And the young people met there with them 10 weeks in a row and plotted out this school. They said, we want a school that's 5 hour day, 1 hour for each art form, and a lunch break in the middle. And developing their structure, calling it the University of Hip Hop. And I always tell the story, even voting, because the argument was such an intellectual, heartfelt, spiritual argument at the end, half of the group wanted it to be the multiversity of hip hop, because they thought the university, I remember someone saying, it means one version. They were like, we're many things. We're so, blah, blah, blah. Like, we're not just a universe, we're a multiverse. And then the other crew was like, man, ain't no one gonna know what, let someone see a t-shirt that says multiversity of hip hop, they're gonna be like, what is that? Like, we want people to know it's a school. And so then they voted and it was 11 to 10. 11 to 10. And in that process, though, they were like, cool, we're the University of Hip Hop, you know? And then unexpectedly, spaces were offered to us, but it was always nomadic Hubbard High School, the Lutheran church nearby, the original Palestinian Women's Collective that became Southwest Youth Collaborative. Southwest Youth Collaborative in its multiple versions. Going back to spaces with Jim, and just kind of rolling around, but always just making sure that opportunities were available to young people. And the last part I would say about the university is I'm reminded when you talked about, well, one, when you said about the back of the yards, I was really upset for a second because I don't think any of us like the fact that all this stuff that happened then is still happening to this day. My daughter teaches there now, and she's already lost 3 students in her 3.5 years of teaching in back of the yards, you know, to gunfire. And those are the type of things that keep a true hip hopper and a true activist always trying to figure out how to make a door open, because Lewis, Shorty Brick, when he came to University of Hip Hop, he came running in the door, fleeing. He had like bandana on, fleeing the gangs in his neighborhood because they all wanted him to turn. And he was under such pressure. And we were like, no, you ever heard of hip hop or this name? You know, he was like, well, sure, whatever. And we said, well, you can always come here. You can always come here and just hang out for hours. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't hang, the block was way too dangerous. And he literally would come in there and watch videos of breaking for hours and train in front of the TV and train with the cipher, with the breakers there, and became one of the top breakers in the United States. And I think that we all should remember that opportunity, access, decolonizing, resource distribution is key. And in this coming era, the next 25 years, we have another second opportunity. All these organizations still exist, the main ones, and they're stronger than they were 25 years ago. And I think that's a beautifully dangerous place to be in, to actualize change.
And we've been working, Lavie and I, the last couple of years in the back of the yards, trying to build a kind of public space to think about, you know, painting and writing, you know, placing, you know, a lot of the work that we're building, equipment, young people together to kind of have a center, you know, to use, you know, outside of the summers. I mean, we were working a lot during the pandemic, outdoors, doing a lot of sort of painting and planting. But, you know, that's certainly what we've been looking at kind of quietly, because when we entered the back of the yards in '95, I mean, I realized that, you know, it was the hottest summer on record. I mean, over 700 people that died just from the heat. You know, the cops were just all over the place, going into, you know,
Clark.
Yeah, collecting yearbooks from the schools to have an index for all the people. And so, you know, nobody wanted to be photographed and nobody was interested in being filmed. And we would have all this kind of public attention, you know, at a moment where, you know, we decided that, you know, working inside of this quiet space was really effective. And so was the building of the radio station. And that was the reason we would use radio to kind of continue to kind of capture these stories and present these sort of testimonials from these young people. And I think we both realized that any sort of admission of our experiences or examples of those experiences, you know, like hanging out with gangs or whatever it was, would completely kind of dismantle any, you know, any sort of democratic sort of building of that space, because that was something that we all sort of understood. And we were very quiet, and that social and civic minded work that was building then was about being very quiet and listening, and to allow the kind of time for the people that we were working with to kind of get their footing, you know, and being around adults that they could trust, you know, and that they saw in themselves. And so that was, you know, that was very important. And I think that was also kind of critical to to it just being, you know, this practice, you know, that's just been easy to kind of move forward. It's just been natural, being kids in the city. I mean, that was it.
And seeds grow. I don't know what the metaphor would be. Seeds, do they intersect under the ground and then make bigger trees? I'll say this first. What I'm thinking about first is, you know, social movement theory says that most social movements last between 12 and 15 years and no longer, usually because they don't adapt to the changing times and don't reconsider or have an anti-methodological approach to their practices to question that which they suddenly think is standard. And the example would be, you know, in the Black activist movement, the civil rights movement, you know, the SCLC, their mission applied for a certain amount of time. But then the young people are like, man, there's something else that's going on. We got something happening in the cities. Your approach isn't quite enough, right? And then, you know, you got SNCC, and then you have the Black Panthers, right? And then out of that, then you have things like the Afrocentric political liberation movement that comes in the early 70s, and the creation of pro-Black schools and these other institutions. The seeds all, they don't go anyplace. I don't know what I'm thinking about, but I'm like, it's like all those little seeds are still in the ground, even when something crazy, whack, maybe someone tried to pour concrete on it. It bursts out. And the reason I mention this is because it just tripped me out when you contacted me and you're like, man, the back of the yards reached out to me and they wanted to do more. They got a big building they want to donate to the cause. We got this school and this organization. And that's all about the seed that was put in 1995, right? That seed didn't go anyplace. That investment of love and being present wasn't forgotten. And that energy comes back around and it's offered back. And then we get to spiral out, offering more with more resources, with the same big family, but with new generations.
Yeah, and it's that 20-year cycle, you know, people kind of come around. And I think there was also, as I was thinking about the circularity of this sort of moment and us sort of talking together, that there was something that happened every 5 years too, like after we met. And I don't think it was a coincidence that every 5 years, it seemed as though you went from one high school to another high school, you know? Yeah. And I thought, well, that had to be, you know, people who had asked me, they thought, you know, I said, well, wait a minute, you know, this is intentional. This is about, you know, spreading the word, spreading the love, and being in, you know, in different communities. And so it was always kind of really wonderful to kind of connect up with those schools, multicultural arts or Hubbard, you know, and even, you know, and going into them and seeing your student, you know, or even like Jinx, one of Jinx's students, you know, it's just kind of amazing that, and I think clear why a lot of the efforts, the people in charge in the back of the yards are really kind of looking to kind of make something happen. And I hope some of that has to do with guilt, you know, because they were around then too. But now I think this is an opportunity to kind of really build some, you know, larger, you know, beautiful things, you know, and that's been what we've been working on through the course of the pandemic, you know, alongside building this kind of exhibition, you know, which isn't, as people have said in the catalog, like Nato Thompson, you know, it's kind of stardust. And I've always saw it that way. It's not the work, you know, the work has been really about building these relationships and to have these allies, you know, that just move with you, you know, and sort of jointly, you know, without, you know, non-verbally, just kind of into these communities. And, you know, and I think what I understood clearly, even from Lavie, who was young at the time, really young at the time, that, there was some responsibility in the youth, educating the peewees, the kind of sharing down the history and the traditions. And that was something that, like many lessons, kind of stuck with me about that architecture of hip hop being something that just could be applicable, wherever we moved in the city. And being in Lawndale, being in the backyards in Austin, and, in the quieter kind of quadrants of the city, and, wanting to get into these buildings, these abandoned buildings, Davion would always tell me what was available for sale, or what we could squat in, but it's odd that, now they're all for sale for $1.
Well,
Let's see.
oh man, that makes me think of bombing. I don't know if I can tell this story. Well, my brother, spiritual brother, and I used to bomb a great deal in areas that were kind of been left behind. And basically our perspective was kind of, we were like, we didn't want to bomb people's properties where we wanted to be in the hood where we came from, but we didn't want to hit anybody's crib that was occupied in the hood. And so we started, we also we didn't think there was any value in painting your own name. So we came up with different names and called ourselves Read the Sorrow. And that was what we painted many places. And we painted beautiful pieces, not just, readable letters. I remember I always painted red, black, and green fill-ins with silver and gold outlines. And my friend would always put Mayan glyphs on his bombings. But we had this horrible incident happen where suddenly we started going through Inglewood and buildings were being ripped down that we had bombed. And we realized that whole broken window theory, well, we didn't really know it, was being used against us. I remember reading, maybe in the Sun Times, I remember reading an article about aldermen in the area around 63rd and Cottage where the train yards are. And they were like, well, we need to raise all these abandoned buildings. They have all this graffiti on them. They have all this. And it really hurt our souls where we were like, damn, we accidentally, did we play into the game, of the man? And, we thought we were beautifying things when maybe we were helping them destroy it. So we then came up with, I guess, would be a different pedagogy where we started going out and bombing community burners or productions, what you would call murals. And I remember the first one that we did was on 69th and Green. It was a closed grocery store, food desert, no working phones. I remember traveling 4 blocks each way to see if there was a payphone that worked. And we had this idea, we were like, we're gonna go out at 5 in the morning and start painting. We're gonna pretend that we're supposed to be here. We're gonna have this fake letter. I typed up the letter, fake the signature, fake phone number. And we're gonna start with positive. My friend said, let's start with positive phrasing first. So I did a community unity. He did an each one, teach one. And he said, then we'll build the burners around that. And I was like, let's go. So then we did that. Then about 2 hours in, the neighborhood's waking up and they come out and they're like, man, what y'all doing? We're like, we're doing this piece for the neighborhood. And they're like, man, that is dope. This is beautiful. And lo and behold, this elder comes out with hose and rakes and clippers, and he starts cleaning up on the wall. And then gangbangers come out, young dudes, and they start cleaning up with him at the wall. And then, we're just keeping painting. And then 5-0 comes up and they're like, hey, what are you doing? And we're like, okay, got the story. And we're like, we were sent by so-and-so to paint this wall because it was, dilapidated. So and they're like, let me see that. And they're like, man, get in the car. And we got in the car and I remember sitting there and I was like, man, I've done so much bombing and painting. And I was like, and the dude, he's like, yeah, we got these guys over here painting this wall. And we don't know, man. They said they're supposed to be here, but no one's answering the phone number. And then the dispatch hold on, I'm gonna put you through the sergeant, right? And then when the sergeant comes on and he's like, what's going on over there? And then he retells the story. And I'm like, damn, man, we're gonna get arrested for sure, man. I was like, but I felt so proud. I was like, man, I'm gonna get arrested doing God's work. I'm not like saying like God, I think God is at the, oh, good, goodness. I don't believe in vengeance, God. And I was like, man, if we get hooked up today, I'm gonna be so proud. I'm gonna call my mother and tell her, yo, I'm doing the right thing. And then the dude goes, he's like, what was on the wall before? No, he said, what's happening? And he's like, well, people are cleaning up in front of the wall and they're sweeping up and they clip the weeds. And then the guy's like, what was on the wall before? And we all knew. He was like, there was a big penis on the wall. And it's like silent. And we're looking at each other like, and the guy goes, let him keep going. And we were like, we got off the car and we kept going. And then we were like, we're gonna do this all over the neighborhood. We're gonna follow this process. We're gonna create a communicative process where we'll paint the viaducts on 59th Street. But it's the process. Writers, if they come out, they first have to meet people on the block. They have to get a list of names of people on the block. They have to meet the head of the block club. They have to get permission and it's okay to paint that viaduct. And they say it's cool. When you paint the viaduct, you can do your burners, but we want to see people's names from the block on there. We want to see the representation of the people that you met. It was a whole new paradigm. And then we just started going and going and going and going and going. And that's how things become substantiated when they're not legal. The alderman, I went to see the alderman and I just told her, I said, we've been painting these viaducts over here. She's like, y'all the ones painting the viaducts? And I won't tell the extended story. I will say, she pulled out a Hebrew tea bag. I said, where the hell did you get that? She said, I was just in Israel at Dimona. I said, with the Hebrew Israelites? And she said, yeah. I said, I'm a Hebrew Israelite. I've been at Dimona. She said, come on in, let's have some tea. And I said, we need a letter so we can keep going. And she said, my secretary will type it up for you right now. And we got to do 30 something viaducts over there. And then now what's so funny is the Inglewood Arts Alliance is repainting some of those walls. And her daughter is the new alderman. And we're gonna meet, and it's a trip. I guess I'm coming back to those seeds. They never go anyplace. It's this bizarre thing. They all keep intertwining and they come back in the next round and the next round, fortunately, with everyone being perseverant and creative. Thanks for listening to that.
Well, and what I was experiencing was certainly completely different. I mean, unless I was meeting you somewhere, I mean, there wasn't really any police presence, unless we're sort of standing at 50th and Drexel or something. And, you're doing this gigantic wall and the cops would roll up, generally would ask me if this was my class. Just sort of this lookout. But on the north side, or on the west side in Austin, when we were trying to use the park, Columbus Park, or any of these sort of open spaces, the park district had a particular policy too, which, was certainly overt on their official sort of, material. But when you went in to kind of arrange to use these spaces, you had to check in with the police department over and over again. And, I remember Davion and I going in, Michael Piazza having to go to the police station and tell them exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it, and just make a case for that kind of work. But it was a completely different experience than those things that, you were dealing with the kids. But there was, it was an introduction into the many sort of layers of working in the city, just making connections with people, just showcasing their work and their writing and their sculptures, their poetry. And anyway, yeah, it's been a ride, it's been really a kind of magical ride working with you and alongside you for so many years. It's got to be pushing 30 years. If you've been teaching for 25 years, it might be 29 years, right? And it's funny when you mentioned your writing, because I thought, man, nobody that I read kind of wrote like you did. And I think that was just the way in which the kind of circuitry of my brain worked around the more poetic, the more kind of free verse, but just thinking about, that sort of time and realizing that, yeah, we would probably easily just sort of stay connected somehow, with this kind of mission that I know is important to you around, and it's important to me as well. And, just being kind of Chicago guys, this has been, something that I've been very proud of, working with you and knowing you and learning as much from you, I mean, let's face it, introducing me to a kind of whole other world, that it's certainly in terms of a proportion in the city greater than the small little segment that I kind of came from, which was sort of one of, just so much more privilege and just being able to kind of move, anywhere that you wanted without the kind of, constant sort of harassment. But,
I gotta say something too that I use this for Jim, something that he taught me that I made a goal was being a vector. Because Jim has this ability to introduce you to like 12 people that you haven't met or put you in a setting with them, or 300 at the Pedagogical Factory. And like, it's like, seems like part of your goal is to connect people, to help make constellations out of all these different types of people. And I'm thinking back to somebody you introduced me to, then like became Department of Space and Land Reclamation.
right.
Then those dudes, I remember taking all these hip hoppers to their meetings. They were like, why are we here? Because I was like, these some badass white mother suckers. They crazy. They were like, all these art missions are crazy. And then I think that some of them became like the co-prosperity sphere, right? Wouldn't that still be the same? Some of them ended up lumping and all these different things. Like a lot of people talk about Chicago is known for our siloed communities and the competition between them. But I think people kind of forget that we're still a union city, and that people cross over those so-called silos a lot and collaborate with each other all the time, even though we might talk ish about each other politically or be like, man, I'm gonna test you. But people have been doing this for so long and there are new iterations.
Right.
And I appreciate that because I made it my own personal goal to be like, make connections, introduce this person to this person. It's not something you might automatically do. But when you suddenly see the smallest little introductions, or I've seen the people you introduced me to become explosive lights in my life and all these opportunities, those things can happen all the time if we take advantage of harmonic convergences. The only way to take advantage of them, though, is to push those bubbles to touch each other and then seeing the awesome combinations that might happen.
Yeah, and that was those guys, and women, the Ed Marzewskis, and who were just starting something as like experimental sound studio was, but the Josh McPhee's and who would start Just Seeds, and Emily Foreman who would start Pirate University, and Nato Thompson was there, who was just heading up the Department of Space and Land Reclamation. But there were these moments too that we just realized that these were concentrated opportunities to kind of just play some things out and understand, that there was an energy to some of these young people all over the city in these pockets, in these 5-year periods that, we could capitalize on, and just build a kind of larger network.
I think maybe we'll take some questions from the audience or from those who are joining us in the live stream.
Yeah, some questions.
There's a question. But this one is from Rachel Harper, and it's from Rachel. What do the two of you think of the next 25 years will bring for learning and making in the neighborhood? So future.
Well, I think that's what we've been talking about. So Rachel Harper asked, what do we think the next 25 years of learning or working in the city will look like? think we've started that already. I think we have a sense of what it will look like. Hopefully, not as much sort of interference, much more support. I think in funding and just in funding and in just being able to, work with these schools and community centers and not-for-profits that are all kind of coming around, and businesses that hopefully they can help us to kind of shore up, some of this work and make it just, not an aspect to the curriculum or to the, the community work, but a kind of, center, to everything, that those spaces can do around just, engaging and working together. But that's what we've been talking about over this pandemic. And yeah, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. I think I see things opening up a bit. It seems very hopeful to me.
I guess I just feel like it's bigger, and better is not the word, just bigger and more exciting. It's always been exciting. It's just like, it seems like the scale is now is growing. If we said like San Miguel might have been the center, it's like Back of the Yards is offering Jim much larger space, opportunities for artists to illuminate the streets, mural opportunities or production opportunities. And then our connective tissue to the other organizations, it's like, basically you could take probably a 12-minute drive past Bishop Shepherd Church in that garden, go by Iman, go by Facts New Hip Hop Collective space, go by the awesome artist who does the photographs, both sides of the city, spacing her name right now. There's like all these points of dopeness, like so close to each other, and folks know each other and are asking, hey, what can we do together? Doing the Planters Project, right? Unexpectedly, Bishop Shepherd being one of the homes of the planters while they were being painted, the Hyde Park Art Center. So funny, just like straight down 51st, you just go, right? The Hyde Park Art Center there. And then like Michelle at the Hyde Park Art Center living right around the corner from Bishop Shepherd, and like going to hang out at their events and wanting to volunteer there. Those like microcosmic stories demonstrate this macrocosmic magic that I'm just ready to see the galaxy unfold with these bangs that are happening.
Yeah. Well, and I'm also talking to some really creative, inspirational sort of leaders of some of these public schools too, like Taft and Kelvin Park, who are just really kind of making some declaration to their staff and faculty about, kind of value and commitment to the arts, in those schools, not as a supplement, but as a kind of core idea of just being imaginative and creative and letting the young people kind of participate, in the kind of construction of their own content. But yeah, it is, there's a lot that's sort of being offered up too. And I will say, as we're looking at the Back of the Yards or other places in the city too, that the DePaul Art Museum is certainly poised to be a kind of center as well for a lot of the work that we've been talking around about University of Hip Hop and Stockyard Institute kind of collaborating with the DePaul Art Museum and thinking about, learning, and, if this is an educated city, and talking about, figuring out maybe a new kind of model that just come from our experiences, specific to Chicago, from the neighborhoods.
Jim, you said something really beautiful earlier, that part of the work was learning how to ask better questions. And so I'm wondering from each of you, if you have any new, I think building on Rachel's question, do you have any new or different questions that you're asking in your own practice? What are some new or different questions?
Well, it's not that I wouldn't have any problem calling anybody out. But I'm thinking about that sincerely. Well, I think about the struggles with working with struggles with working in kind of the field of education that seems so difficult, much of the time. And there's certainly reasonable reasons why, larger sort of school systems or institutions operate the way they do, and they do it based on the kind of, needs that they have to meet, and over, dealing with a kind of large volume of people, and it's completely sort of reasonable. I think the questions that I would have at this point is, let us in, experiment with these sort of ideas that have been, field tested, for 30 years, where we're working with, young people who have been now teaching, for many years, their own students in these communities. I think that is the kind of question I ask, as I roam around the city. That's a primary question I have. And it's not a slam. I mean, I've never felt that that was useful. I just think that these opportunities that we're talking about, we're kind of ready to kind of share some of those, or sit at the table and have real meaningful conversations about, art and pedagogy, and these neighborhoods that in some cases, like the back of the yards, really haven't changed at all, which breaks my heart, I mean,
New and different questions. I don't know, man. I think the same question lead to new experiences, which is just like, what y'all want to do, and is there any role that our people, our energy could play in that? That's always an essential question, but something that some of our people who are now, young people who are now educators and adults have pointed out is legacy, which I think as a hip hopper, never really thought about legacy. Being a graffiti writer, everything is temporary. It's like always a Sam Mandela, but like fact has been like, maybe the nomadic institution time is over. Maybe we should have a space. Maybe we should consider, I've always been, hip hoppers rarely archive, their work or their practices or their curriculum. Very rarely. Many artists don't. How do we now, and the Stockyard maybe being a stimulus for this, document what has been accomplished and continuing a legacy in a conscientious and conscious manner going forward? And then I think the last 5-6 years has really been, for me, the question is how to serve the youth movements that are really ready to rock the earth and started to, and were kind of temporarily derailed with COVID. For my sensibility, watching the March for Our Lives happen and watching these organizations coming out, peace warriors from North Lawndale meeting with the kids in Florida and uniting, and manifesting this nationwide movement that millions of people have believed in and thought about, but never got to speak on. Or, is her name Greta, the environmental activist, sparking right now, young people are just, there's no risk, they're ready, so it's like, what do we do as allies from the adult universe to submit to their will and activate on their terms because there is an intergenerational power if we're all together. But that's a big question I have, is like, there are youth movements, mega youth movements right now. How do we continue to push energy and support those in whatever way they ask, and make sure that our amnesiac tendencies in the United States don't take over and bury all the things that really, the major things that developed and were accomplished in this last 5 years, including last year.
Jennifer asks, what are your thoughts on the pandemic fear of cities and people with means moving out, and the important role that diverse cities play in social practice, in art and democracy in general?
That was like a 3-layer question. What is the role of what? Cities?
Art and democracy in these cities, but the role of social practice. And I think specifically in Chicago, it's certainly been a kind of long practice that, I saw in 1975. I mean, whether it was the kind of mural movement of the 60s or this kind of printmaking collective sort of rising up in the 70s. I think it comes down to who we saw in our neighborhoods, those art teachers kind of, being a place where, we could kind of go and connect to. But, those particular sort of moments of us being young and connecting up with the communities we lived in, diverse communities that we lived in, is sort of the basis, that's forming all this work. It's not new work, the social and civically engaged kind of work. It's been in Chicago, my whole life I've seen it. And I don't know what the answer to that is, except maybe what Lavie was saying about, being able to kind of help and be allies to these young people who have the energy and who have nothing to lose, to kind of move through these schools or these, communities, and being able to just, speak on their own behalf, fearlessly. And I think that, that's just something that, we have to encourage somehow. And I think that's the responsibility of the people who sort of, run these institutions or sites.
In the changing urban climate, there's 2 contradictory forces, which is, the first, of course, is gentrification, and the removal of poor communities and communities of color by force or by continued disfranchisement and purchasing of properties, or holding or having a property impossible. And then we have the explosion of our generation in places of political power and influence. So it's weird to me, not weird. I'm like, wow, Justin Slaughter, he's the representative for the South Side. And, we were all hanging out. He was in many university hip hop events. And now he's in a position of power to activate certain things, or crime, right? People that are running for office and succeeding and massively changing the so-called aesthetic frontier of the city. The new alder person in Pilsen is just a key thing, that on her staff, she had former graffiti writers, and Pease reached out to her and specifically was like, look, we have been asking to illustrate communities in our community forever. Can you grant permission to do that? And she gave over that whole chunk from Damon, further from Western all the way to Halstead, said, go ahead. And writers didn't go out and do accommodative murals that sacrifice their aesthetic or the way they do things. Writers went out and did hardcore pieces, and they're going to stay up. And I think they're going to stay up for a long time because the new generation is moving in. But then at the same time in Pilsen, you have the landmark the attempt to landmark certain blocks in Pilsen, so that, you know, once a block is landmarked, you can't change the facade or do any construction on your building without applying for a heavy duty permit and usually having to plunge dozens of thousands of dollars into transforming your facade. So there's these two forces in our urban areas that are that can go heads up. And then it's also very tricky because the gentrification force, which once was against the writer aesthetic, now is infatuated with it. And it is something that gives value to a community where before it detracted from basically a right kind of north side perspective, right? And so it's really kind of looking at that landscape and being proactive to figure out how not to lose to these gentrifying manipulations and to take advantage of the sectors that our generation is now invading and putting forth the things that we would like to prioritize.
And people have left Chicago in masses, you know, as long as Chicago's been here. I have no sympathy for them. You know, I mean, we're here, you know, there's things to do. There is enough work, and I enjoy seeing the cops like corral you and your crew, you know, in the early days, which, you know, now they kind of come with these kind of commissions, or, you know, from the same institutions like the Park District or the Chicago Public Schools or the city of Chicago. And I think that that is something that, you know, has clearly gained ground. And so this is an opportunity to kind of capitalize on that moment. But I know Jennifer, and I know that, you know, she's interested in the kind of cities, you know, the kind of movement of cities. But in this city, you know, yeah, people leave.
Hi, thank you so much for this generous stories you shared with us. Truly mind-expanding, but I was wondering, just going off the first question, that, you know, given the Stockyard Institute, both of your practices being interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, pushing boundaries to kind of free up those conventionally kind of cordoned off spaces. Do you see how maybe this experimental arts pedagogy that, you know, that you form could potentially in the future begin to, I don't know, just expand maybe other fields and other disciplines and ways of doing that don't necessarily belong in the arts? Because at least for someone like me, it seems to be so, yeah, so much, like, it's a multiverse, like you were saying earlier, it really is. And I'm wondering, how does an arts pedagogy inform, like, people who are going into politics, people who are going into engineering or other fields? Do you see that for the next 25 years in any way, from the standpoint that I am?
Well, I can't. I mean, I think that, you know, we're interested in an awful lot of things. I think that's exactly what kind of keeps us working. You know, we happen to be artists, you know, but we're, you know, we've been working with like businesses and, you know, institutions in the back of the arts. And, you know, I think our pleas when we were young were to just sort of be at these tables, you know, with all different kinds of people, and knew that we'd have to talk to the aldermen or the alderwoman. We'd have to talk to the police department. We'd have to talk to, you know, the block clubs, and we'd have to, you know, just get everything kind of okayed. But, you know, I think we were all really sort of good at just persevering and bringing in as many people as we could to do what we wanted to do. And so not all of them were artists, you know, I think not all of them were artists. You know, I deal with all kinds of people, as do you, you know, I mean, that I know of, you know. I think it's, you know, it's about, you know, using your whole life and thinking about just kind of imaginative ways of just making these spaces in our work and our practice, and, you know, just much more inhabitable, you know, and guided by things that we're just really interested in. But I hope so. I mean, yeah, I've been having some really crazy conversations lately, and no one's an artist that I'm
Is that Pia over there? Oh my God. Arts administration? Oh my God. Okay. All right. We'll do it again because I was like, I haven't seen you forever. Okay. Yeah, it's different. I think like it's gonna take like purposeful initiatives towards doing that. Because at first I was kind of thinking, about the folks, like when I walked in San Miguel, some people I didn't know were artists because they looked like they were a plumber or so-and-so, or like I didn't really know, but they were an artist that used plumbing or something, I don't know. But to really engage a community, right? Like I'm really curious to see like the Inglewood Arts Alliance, right? And some of these organizations, what they're doing is doing some very different processes where, you know, they're having community meetings for like a year about something, and then they're having these paint out days where like the whole community comes, and then you can offer to do something different on those days. It's kind of a festive day of prepping the wall. And I think having opportunities like that, there are conversations that can happen that people might not think about. But I also think that there's probably going to have to be some also kind of directive purpose to be like, hey, how do we make sure that we are expanding the expansion with the community, in the community, is also using the myriad talents of the community. I think like when we created the University of Hip Hop community gardens and the butterfly gardens, we actually didn't realize like South Side of Chicago has all this agricultural knowledge. I mean, like infinite. People are going in between their farms in the South and Chicago all the time. And we're out there digging, and all these elders are coming out and they're schooling us on like what we're doing wrong. They're coming and digging with us, and then creating a relationship, be like, man, can you help to maintain the garden for the next 3 years? So it's like your garden, you know? But like, I think it's not, we can't trust that it may happen by happenstance. To have like an inclusive conversations that maybe asking very different questions. Like, man, what do you want to do for the neighborhood? Like, and I'll be honest, I think churches are in spiritual center, religious institutions are very good for that. Like watching Bishop Shepherd, there's people of various different talents and abilities that are contributing to their community garden. Or we go over to Iman, there's so many different people contributing to that conversation. And Iman has a very distributed conceptualization of community development on the community's terms, which takes people of all sorts of different backgrounds. So I think you kind of have to we have to make sure we remember that we have to have that as a purpose to make it happen.
Yeah, and it's not an accident that most of them are run by women. You know, that I circulate amongst, you know, like the Bishop Shepherd or some of those powerful sort of female and lioness women who are sort of there, you know, making sure, you know, the daily work is going on. And
if you were going to give one piece of advice, I guess, to a young educator starting out, for me, I'm interested in collaborative spaces, and spaces are spaces where you're fostering kind of an interdisciplinary approach. And I wonder, like, is there, I know this whole conversation's been about that, but we're, I don't know, a little piece of advice when starting out, just but where to begin?
Man, a little piece of advice, which I like was validated when a student spoke in Bert Stabler's class in ISU, which is like oftentimes the resources and the partnerships are right there, but we may not have asked or went and said, hey, what's up? And I'm thinking about like when I do my units, when I develop my units for my high school students, my purpose is to have their works exhibited in 3 different spaces outside of school. I don't know where those spaces may end up being, oftentimes those spaces will happen just through an accidental ask or bumping into someone being like, we're looking for blah, 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 and this and that. And the student in his class said, man, I wanted to do something in the neighborhood, but I didn't know. So I just went up to the library and was like, can my students do an exhibit here? And she said they were so excited. They were like, we've never had a youth exhibit here. And they like totally got her back. And now they're going into the second year round. And so never hesitate, I would say, to humbly ask, because to do things with people, because you would be surprised how fast people would be like, yeah. And one last anecdote is, I remember there was a teacher at CBS High School. I think he only taught his class 2 active days of the week, because he would basically go down this phone list of all these experts in other fields that he would bring in to teach his class. And he would just be like, hey, can you come? And they'd be like, sure, I'll come out for a day. And like, they would just be like, cool. And so like, he had other people teaching. I mean, basically his kids were exposed to so many different backgrounds and people of totally different backgrounds, you know? So that let's remember that it's there, but you know, we just have to pursue it. And you'd be surprised, because then every yes like turns into 5 other possible relationships that you might not expect.
Agreed completely. I mean, it's nice to gather your close friends, you know, around you that, you know, but I think the work of the Stockyard Institute was always to think about exactly that, what that means to a young person or anybody you're working with, to kind of broadcast your work and to sort of put it in an exhibition or out in the street or share it with some kind of official. I mean, it's all of those things at the same time. And I think whenever that opportunity arises too, to kind of, you know, run into somebody who might be able to kind of help you out or make some change, you just have to be really ready. You have to be prepared, you know. Just have to be ready. Yeah.
Be flexible.
You know, when they
Be
ask
ready.
you, what are you working on? You know, not to kind of like hum and haw, just say, you know, I'm working on this, you know, I need this much money. Can you help me? You know, I think people like that. I love hearing that, you know, instead of saying, well, I'm, you know, I don't know what I'm working on.
Steal from the rich and give it to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think it's time to wrap up. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. If you haven't seen the exhibition and you're in Chicago, please come to the museum. Shows are up through February 13th. Please give a hand to Jim from Lavie. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh wait, can I do something before we close? I wanted to bust a rhyme, but I did.
Yeah, you gotta bust, you gotta
that
close
okay?
out. Just-
All right. And I hope I remember. I might. We'll see what's up. Kingdom for children. Grow, replenish, reproduce, and be prolific. Warriors of the light illuminate shadows in this ultimate battle. B-girls, vandals, record spinners versus BP shells, and all the corporate sinners. We paint, break, touch, make trains roll, just as leaves of apple seeds bring back the love that was stole, took, buried, hidden in the knowledge cemetery by crooks, thieves, fiends, derivatives of devilish kings. Citibank watches over you while your ass gets chased. Los Macheteros, the heroes that snap Wells Fargo's embargo. Let me catch that bitch catching this bonus. Opponents, we opponents, proponents of corporate capital think they own us. War for the light, luminous crafts. Vision villages build paths that erupt in the aftermath. Families, force fields, the source of course, the force survive. Togetherness keeps hope alive. Myopia and false utopias, open your eyes. In the world of the rich, children dies in the buys and buys. In our world, children laugh, create, remake, flourish, nourish, and compassionate courage. It's hard to imagine. Love happens every day. Giving, hugging, rocking, bugging while others take away. So grow, gain experience from familiar and strange. Replenish, never diminish what the earth has sustained. Reproduce, increase for the least and those left behind. Be prolific, fulfill the fruit and harvest of mine. This is a call to all humankind to build uplift so all children of the sun shine. Thanks, team.
That answer your question. Or just follow him around for 30 years.
Dude.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So dope.
Yeah.